continue our tour of the Move, Selection, and Layout tools of the Photoshop Tools panel. In the previous video, we explored the four marquee tools: the rectangular marquee, the elliptical marquee, and the single row and single column marquee tools. Oftentimes, though, we want to make selections that are irregularly shaped, not necessarily being a rectangle or square or elliptical or a circle, but maybe an object itself. And for such purposes, we have the lasso tools. There are three lasso tools: the lasso tool, the polygonal lasso, and the magnetic lasso. And as I mentioned in the previous video, when you see that little triangle in the bottom right-hand corner of a tool, it means there are multiple tools there. Notice the keyboard shortcut of these are all L. We can get to those three tools by either holding down the mouse on the little triangle or right-clicking on the tool. If I'm in another tool, such as the rectangular marquee tool, and I press the letter L, you'll notice that it jumps to the lasso tool. And if I hold down the shift key and press the letter L, it will cycle through those three tools. So there's the lasso, the polygonal lasso, and the magnetic lasso. I'm going to go back to the lasso tool and let's look at how we use that. With the lasso tool selected, notice that we have options on the options bar. Very similar to what we had on the marquee tools. We can make a new selection, we can add to an existing selection, subtract from the selection, and do an intersection of two different selections. We also have options for feathering the selection, giving it a little softer edge, as well as anti-aliasing, which will also help out that edge around circular areas or arced areas. And then we already saw the select and mask button that we'll look at much later down in the course. I usually use feather at 0, have anti-alias checked. Now to use the lasso tool, it's basically just freehand drawing. So I can come in and hold down the mouse and draw around an object. That will select that area. Might come into the edit menu and choose content aware fill, and let's watch what happens. The green area here of this dialog box is there it's going to draw from in replacing the selection. And I'm just going to get rid of kind of this balloon here so it's not being used. We'll come up here and I can see the result over here. I'm going to click OK. And voila, if I do a Control H to hide the selection or Control D to deselect, you'll notice that balloon is gone. And it did a pretty good job of filling in that area using the content aware, using what is in the area around that. That's the content aware, the contents around the selection. Now in the layers, it added a new layer where it painted in the content aware above the balloon. I can turn that layer off and go back to the balloon. Let's do another one. I'm going to come back to my background layer. And again, I'm just going to do a lasso around this balloon. Edit, content aware fill. And we can see the result. We get a little bit of the ground up here in the sky of the cloud. And it's not always 100% accurate in doing this. So I can modify the selection and maybe get maybe a little better area up here. So maybe if I got rid of some of the ground area, that seems to help a little bit. I'm going to click OK. And so it did a decent job. I can use some other tools, come in and fix this area of the cloud where this seems to be reflecting some of the ground. Now, of course, we can always go back, going Edit, Undo, and we can undo several layers. Or we can also go to the History panel and go backwards in the History panel. With the polygonal lasso, we draw straight segments rather than drawing freehand. So I can click and then move my mouse and click and form a polygon of several lines, and that makes the selection. And we can do the same thing with that as we would with the freehand lasso. So again, I can come in, say Edit, Content Aware Fill, decide where I want to pull from, and you can see it looks pretty good. I'm going to go back in my history, and let's take a look at the Magnetic Lasso. Now for this one, I'm going to use that other document that we downloaded from the previous video, the photo by Bryce Bowler. And I'll demonstrate first the Polygon Lasso here. And we can get pretty close to the edges, but we're going to get some of the sky. Just plain and simple. That's just how it's going to be with that tool. Now the cool thing with having made the selection is I could do a Control-C to copy that selection, or go to the Edit menu and choose Copy Selection. And then go back to my other balloon image and do a Control-V to paste. And there's my balloon. But it's very obvious that that was brought in from another document. So I'm going to undo that. Control-Z to undo a couple times. Let's go back to our Bowler balloon image. I'm going to do a Control-D to deselect. Now we're going to take the Magnetic Lasso tool. And let's watch what that does. As I go along the edge of the balloon, it kind of snaps along it. Now, I made a couple mistakes there. I got a little bit of sky, and that's okay. We can always fix those. And when I get to where I want to try started, I can just double click. And there is my selection, very tight to the balloon. I've got a little bit of area here on the sky. So here's where I might use that subtract selection option. Maybe zoom in. So if you just get right along the edge of that balloon, and then I'm going to come over, double click. That looks pretty good. Let's do the same thing up here. A lot of times in making selections, you're going to find zooming in is going to be really beneficial. That all looks pretty good. So now I'm going to do a Control-C to copy. Let me zoom out here first. Control-C to copy. Go to my balloon image. Let's do a Control-V to paste. Now that looks much better. Still would need some cleanup. And the lighting on this obviously is much brighter than lighting on the rest of my document. So lots of stuff we need to do to make this better. We'll look at doing adjustments in Unit 2. That's how we can move elements from one image to another image, and using the Polygonal Lasso to do a very tight selection. Now one other thing on the Polygonal Lasso, I'm going to go back to my original document. Actually, just do a Control-Z a couple times to undo that. We also have some options with the Polygonal Lasso tool of width, contrast, and frequency. To explain the width, I'm going to hold down the caps lock, or press the caps lock, and notice what happens. My cursor goes from the Polygonal Lasso tool with the arrow, which is where we're selecting is the tip of that arrow, to a crosshairs inside of a circle. And with the width, as I'm going to deselect here for a minute, as I'm drawing along, it's examining the pixels within that circular area to determine where to put the lasso. If I make that, oh, this is a good point here. If I come try to make changes, you're going to have problems. So again, I'm just going to deselect everything. We want to make sure we make these changes beforehand. I'll make this 30 pixels, and notice now that it's a much larger circle. So it's sampling from a larger area. Now, we saw I can't go up and change on the options bar while this is active. but you can use the bracket keys on your keyboard. So the left bracket will make the width smaller and the right bracket makes it larger. So you can change on the fly the area that you're sampling. The contrast is looking at the difference in the pixels, mostly on lightness, figuring out where to lay down that lasso selection. I would select the contrast based on your subject. This has a pretty low contrast, and by the way, you can change the contrast on the fly with a comma going lesser contrast and a period going greater contrast. And another little tip here is if you go slower, you're probably going to get a better selection. The frequency determines how often it's sampling. So notice I've got some gaps between the points that it's making there. And I'm at a frequency of 57. I'm going to double click to join the beginning and end selection. I'm going to deselect, Control D. Let's make this frequency say a 10. And now as I come along, I'm not getting points very often. Again, I'm going to double click, Control D to deselect. Let's set this up to a much higher frequency, say of 100. And now I'm getting a lot more points. So it really depends on your image as to what those settings should be. You just have to experiment with it. Now, again, I'm going to double click and deselect. So we saw for the Polygonal Lasso, if I have the caps lock down, I get the crosshairs inside the circular area that's being sampled. I'm going to go back to the lasso tool and let the caps lock up. So there's my normal lasso tool. And again, I'm drawing with where the arrow is. But if I put the caps lock on, now I get a crosshair. So I'm drawing with the crosshairs. It really is a matter of which mouse pointer you prefer to use. And in some cases, you might find one easier than another based on your image. Same way with the Polygonal Lasso. There's our normal Polygonal Lasso icon. But if I put the caps lock on, I get crosshairs. And I can make my polygonal selection that way. One more thing on the Polygonal Lasso. If you hold the Shift key down, you'll constrain the movements to horizontal, vertical, or 45 degrees. And if you just double click, it's going to join beginning and end points. So that's a brief look at the lasso tools. My encouragement to you is open up a bunch of images and just play around with those tools. Practice those tools. And depending on your image, you will find that one of those tools probably works better than another. And which tool works best is largely going to come through your practice sessions. If you'd like to see more videos in the Photoshop Practicum playlist, click the title at the bottom. If you'd like to be alerted to new videos, please click my photo in the top right to subscribe to the channel.